If you stand on the east coast of Britain and look toward the North Sea, the horizon seems final. Water, weather, shipping lanes, wind farms, fishing grounds, and then Europe somewhere beyond sight. But for thousands of years, that horizon was not water, it was country. There were low hills where there is now sea. There were marshes, wooded valleys, reed beds, lagoons, rivers, and seasonal camps. People crossed that landscape on foot. They hunted there. They fished there. They gathered hazelnuts and berries there. They followed animals, moved with the seasons, and lived in a world that joined Britain to the European mainland. Today we call that vanished place Doggerland. The name sounds almost mythical, but the evidence is not myth. It has come up in fishing nets, in dredged sand, in seismic survey data, in sediment cores, in antler tools, in bones, and in the shape of buried valleys beneath the seabed. This is not a story about a single city swallowed in one dramatic night. It is slower than that and stranger. It is the story of a whole human landscape becoming sea. Doggerland was not a small island or a narrow bridge. In the early Holocene, after the last major ice age, it formed a broad zone of land across what is now the southern North Sea. It connected eastern Britain with the Low Countries and parts of northwest Europe. To modern eyes, it can be hard to imagine because our maps teach us that seas are permanent. The coastline looks like a fact, but during glacial periods, sea levels were lower because so much water was locked in ice sheets. As the climate warmed and ice melted, the sea returned. The old lowlands did not vanish at once. They changed by degrees. National Geographic describes the late Doggerland landscape as a mix of gently sloping hills, marshland, heavily wooded valleys, and swampy lagoons. That matters because it was not just dry ground. It was habitat. It was a place rich in edges, land meeting water, woodland meeting marsh, river meeting coast. Those edges are often where animals gather, where fish are available, where birds nest, and where people can live well by knowing the seasons. So when we say Doggerland was a land bridge, that is true, but incomplete. A bridge is something you cross. Doggerland was also somewhere people stayed. For a long time, Doggerland was known mostly through accidents. Fishermen dragged up bones and tools from the seabed. A famous early find came in 1931 when the trawler Calinda brought up a piece of peat from near the Lehman and Ower banks in the North Sea. Inside was a barbed antler point, often called the Calinda harpoon. Archaeology magazine notes that experts connected it to the Mesolithic world of hunter-gatherers, and the object helped make clear that the seabed had once held an inhabited landscape. That is the haunting thing about Doggerland. It announced itself as fragments. One tool, one antler point, a bone, a lump of peat, a fossil, a scatter of artifacts moved by trawlers and tides. Then the scale changed. Offshore oil and gas exploration had produced enormous seismic data sets from the North Sea. Archaeologists began using those industrial traces for a different purpose, mapping the buried shape of a prehistoric world. National Geographic reports that researchers reconstructed a digital model of roughly 46,120 square kilometres, or about 18,000 square miles, of Doggerland before it flooded. Europe's lost frontiers pushed this work further, combining seabed mapping, ship expeditions, sediment cores, environmental evidence, and modelling. Archaeopress describes the project as confirmation that landscapes once considered inaccessible to archaeology can be studied directly. That sentence is easy to pass over, but it is the key. Doggerland is not only a lost place, It is a test of whether archaeology can follow human history below the waterline. The people of Doggerland were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. That phrase can sound simple, as if it describes one way of life everywhere. But hunter-gatherer worlds are built from detailed local knowledge, where fish run, when nuts ripen, when deer move, which plants return after flooding, where dry ground remains in winter, and which routes are safe when the marsh changes. National Geographic describes Doggerland's people as seasonal movers who fished, hunted, and gathered foods such as hazelnuts and berries. That seasonal rhythm is important. It means Doggerland was not necessarily a landscape of fixed towns in the later agricultural sense. It was a landscape of repeated returns. A fishing place, a hunting place, a camp on higher ground, a path along a river, a memory of where the reeds opened into water. The archaeological record is thin because the sea is a rough archivist. It preserves some things and erases others. It moves objects out of context. It buries surfaces under sediment. It makes direct excavation difficult. That is why modern Doggerland research often combines different kinds of evidence: artifacts, seabed topography, cores, ancient environmental traces, and models of how water moved through the landscape. This also means we have to be careful. We can reconstruct possibilities with increasing confidence, but we should not invent diary entries for people who left us no writing. The honest picture is still vivid. A low North Sea world, small groups moving through a rich wetland mosaic, fires on dry ground, nets or traps near water, antler and bone tools, children learning a coastline that would not stay where their grandparents remembered it. The end of Doggerland was not one event. Sea level rise was the main long-term pressure. The 2024 Quaternary International Study, summarised through the University of Groningen Research portal, states plainly that sea level rise was a key force changing early Holocene environments in northwest Europe, inundating large areas of what is now the North Sea. The same study argues that improved inundation models can show earlier area loss than previous models, including significant area loss around 10.5 to 10,000 calibrated years before present. In other words, the drowning of Doggerland began as a long transformation. Land became coast, coast became marsh, marsh became tidal, dry routes narrowed, familiar valleys changed. People did not necessarily wake up one morning and discover a world gone. More likely, generations lived with a landscape that kept revising itself. That is one reason Doggerland feels modern. Climate change is not only a number on a graph. It is the movement of the practical world. It changes where food can be found, where homes can stand, where routes remain open, and what a community has to remember. But Doggerland also has one dramatic moment attached to it: Storegga. Around 8,150 years before present, the Storegga tsunami struck northwest Europe. It was caused by a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway. For years, this wave has been part of Doggerland's popular ending. A giant tsunami sweeps across the North Sea and drowns the last of the lost land. There is truth here, but the best current story is more nuanced. The Antiquity article, A Great Wave, the Storegga Tsunami, and the End of Doggerland, says that the size of the wave led many to assume a devastating impact on Mesolithic communities and the final inundation of Doggerland. But the authors present evidence from the southern North Sea and argue that traditional notions of a catastrophically destructive event may need rethinking. That does not mean the tsunami was small or harmless. It means impact depended on local topography. A wave hitting one low coast is not the same as a wave hitting another. Some areas may have been vulnerable, others may already have been reduced, transformed, or sparsely used. The same paper notes that by the time the tsunami struck, higher sea level had probably reduced Dogger Island to a shallow sandbank. So the Storegga tsunami may be better understood not as the whole story, but as a violent chapter near the end of a much longer retreat. That is less cinematic than a single apocalypse. It is also more interesting, because if the final lesson is only a wave came, then Doggerland becomes a disaster scene. But if the lesson is that communities lived for generations with rising water, shrinking ground, changing coastlines and occasional shocks, then Doggerland becomes a human story. The name Doggerland is modern. Archaeology magazine notes that University of Exeter archaeologist Brian E. Coles coined the term in the late 1990s, naming it after Dogger Bank, the submerged sandbank east of England associated with Dutch fishing vessels called doggers. There is something fitting about that. The name comes from the sea, from fishing, from the modern world unknowingly working above the old one. For the people who lived there was no Doggerland. There were places with their own meanings, camps, ridges, channels, beaches, woods, crossings, and stories we cannot recover. That gap matters. We have a name for the drowned landscape, but not for the people as they named themselves. We can map the valleys, but not the full emotional geography. We can say Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, but that is a category, not a community's own voice. The best documentary approach is to keep both truths in view. Science can recover an astonishing amount. It can show that this was not fantasy. It can map, date, model, compare, and test, but it cannot give back everything the sea took. Doggerland is often called a warning, and it is. National Geographic draws a comparison between Mesolithic people displaced by rising water and modern populations living close to shorelines. But the warning should be handled carefully. The Mesolithic world was not the modern world. Population, technology, infrastructure, politics, and speed of change are different. We should not flatten the past into a slogan. What Doggerland gives us is more subtle. A deep-time example of how coastlines can move through human lives. It reminds us that maps are temporary. It reminds us that the ground beneath a society is not only physical. It is memory, routine, food, travel, story, and belonging. When the land changes, the meaning of life changes with it. And it reminds us that lost landscapes are not empty. The North Sea did not cover a blank space. It covered a lived world. Today, Doggerland sits beneath shipping routes and storms, beneath fishing grounds and energy projects, beneath water that looks timeless because we arrived late. But the seabed still holds pieces of the old country: peat, pollen, bones, tools, buried channels, digital shadows in seismic data. The remains are scattered, but together they make a quiet argument. The past is not only behind us, sometimes it is below us, and somewhere under the North Sea, a drowned landscape still keeps the shape of paths that people once knew by heart.